This is Buffalo What's Next. I'm Jay Moran.
I'm Brigid Jaipaul Valenza.
And I'm Dave Debo. If ever there was an issue that demands more discussion now, the racist massacre at Tops Friendly Markets on May 14th is it.
You know, America has a long, deep, rich history of racism brutalizing black communities.
But where does it go from here? What does our community need?
We must work and teach our children.
What issues just aren't being addressed?
As long as we keep doing the same thing, we're just sitting ducks for the next mass shooting. That's all you can say.
This is a new program. Every weekday, we'll set aside this hour to hear from the community about issues that can no longer be held back.
We need to make a concerted effort in our nation, in our institutions, and yes, in our family.
And good morning. Thank you very much for joining us on Buffalo What's Next. I'm Jay Moran. Glad to be along with you. A nice show ahead for us here later. Brigid Jaipaul. Valenza is going to be talking with psychologist Ursuline Bankhead, who spent much of her youth in the East Side neighborhood that, of course, is impacted by the shooting 3 Saturdays ago, and also later on Miles Gresham from the Partnership for the Public Good. We'll be with Dave Debo. Well, right now we're pleased to be joined by the Reverend Corey Gibson of Calvary Baptist Church here in Buffalo. Good morning to you, Reverend.
Good morning, Jay. Thank you so very kindly for having me this morning.
I most certainly am pleased to have you. And when I talked to you last week, you said you wanted to be part of this conversation moving forward. Obviously, you're a busy man. There's been so much happening in your parish and, of course, throughout the East Side right now. But as we are now just a couple of weeks out of this mass shooting that occurred at the Tops, what has struck you about what has been going on in the community so far?
Well, for me, I think just the unity that this tragic incident has brought about here within not only our local community here on the east side of Buffalo, but throughout the city as a whole. It has been refreshing just to see a city which has historically been divided in so many regards come together to not only rally and to put our arms around the family members of those victims whose lives were tragically taken, but who have also come together to ask the question, what can I do so that I can make sure something like this doesn't happen again? And what more specifically can I do to ensure that we help to address the needs that have come about as a result of this tragedy?
I most certainly want to get into that, but it was interesting you talked about the unity, and we've heard that from other people as well. There are some skeptics who say, though, once the media cameras move off of the East Side, which, of course, on a national level, it's pretty much the case so far here. Do you see a new hope for greater unity? And I'm talking about in terms of the racial divide at this moment, because there's been study after study that said Buffalo is among the most segregated cities in the United States. What about that? Do you have a better sense right now?
Well, I'm one who certainly believes in hope. I maintain hope. That is what I preach on a weekly basis. That's what I teach on a regular basis. So I do have hope that there is a new found sense of unity after all that has transpired. The unfortunate reality is that, as you've already mentioned, once the media's attention is no longer spotlighting incidents where things like this occur, unfortunately, we tend to lose momentum. We tend to die down as the coverage does. But I believe that this, because it's happened so close to home, that it certainly has put us in a position here in the city to ensure that we, again, position ourselves to ensure that we are doing our very best to not only maintain a sense of unity, but to start addressing, more importantly, those tough issues that we have shied away from so long regarding systemic racism, regarding white supremacy. I believe we're now in a position now where we're forced, because, again, of its proximity. We've heard of these incidents taking place miles away in other states and other cities. But to have it happen right here in our very own city, I think it's put us in a great position where we no longer can sit back and act as if those issues don't exist.
You talk about hope, and of course that is always very encouraging. I would think that in your position, of course, hope is something that you're going to have with you throughout your days here on this planet. But at the same time, what about anything that's giving you a concrete sense that, yes, things could be different, can be different? I mean, have you heard from those people who really can make a difference, right? I mean, we can do all the grassroots that we want, but there are people in power who have access to capital and have access to policy that can make a difference. Any sense right now that there is a change there?
Well, I think we've always, for years, have always talked about holding those elected officials and those who have political power, holding them accountable. But I think now the accountability level has really gone up in many regards. That now, because we've had a national spotlight, that individuals will have to, again, be held accountable for what they've promised. I think now we also have to look at really just the long-term impact of what has taken place. And so when we look at, again, those resources that were really beginning to come into our community when this tragedy occurred, with food distribution, having conversations regarding having multiple options for individuals within the community to take advantage of, having affordable access to mental health services, grief support services. Those things are, again, those aren't issues that we haven't had on the table before. But I'm very hopeful that now there will be a greater level of accountability for those individuals, as well as those persons who are on the ground, not only making sure that we hold those persons in power accountable, but also making sure that we're trying to figure out how we can create some synergy so that we can address the people collectively. Interesting to hear
that you mentioned mental health access in your conversation here. Obviously, there's been a lot of that conversation going on. A lot of firms have opened up and have been available at, say, the Johnny B. Wiley Pavilion and things along those lines.
Yes.
But from you, for a pastor who's talking with parishioners throughout the week, I'm sure, are you sensing a real mental health crisis, for lack of a better term, or perhaps maybe you can position that and nuance it a little bit more, but that there are some real concerns coming out of this shooting for other members of the community?
Those concerns were already there, Jay. And what I mean by that is prior to this mass shooting, we had just the mental effects that had not been addressed via COVID, what had taken place via COVID, and what type of mental toll and impact that took. But even long before that, when we just talk again about systemic racism, and we talk again about the lack of access that has plagued communities such as the east side of Buffalo and other urban contexts, there always has been a need prior to this incident taking place. But now I believe that we're starting to begin to have, again, those tough conversations about not only dismantling some of the misnomers around mental health support, all right, because, again, those individuals who reside in this community, people of color, we don't always have a high level of trust as it relates to sharing our feelings and sharing how we're doing emotionally. As a matter of fact, it's just something that was instilled in us, even within our home environment, that what happens in the house stays in the house. And so, again, that's already a barrier that we've had to already try to tear down. But again, now that we're in a position where we're starting to see what those resources are, and we're also starting to see that those resources can be made available if persons who, again, are in power make the concerted effort. Now we're in a place where we can start to not only have those resources at our disposal, but start to let individuals know that these resources are here and that we can make sure that you have access to them.
Our guest on Buffalo What's Next is the Reverend Corey Gibson of Calvary Baptist Church here in Buffalo. Reverend Gibson, you're a native of Buffalo. You're educated in Virginia, but started your ministry in Virginia before coming back here. Can you talk then a little bit about how the racism of Buffalo, how the poverty of Buffalo wears on our black and men or young men and women?
Absolutely, absolutely. Again, as you mentioned, I was not only born and raised here, but also, again, educated here until my time in college when I attended Virginia Union University, and then spent a great number of years in Virginia before returning back here in 2019. I think the biggest blow that oftentimes is impacted by men of color, African American men more specifically, who grow up in the inner city on the east side of Buffalo, there's a blow to your self-esteem. All right, oftentimes again, because of the lack of resources, we oftentimes feel, growing up here on the east side of Buffalo, that possibilities are not limitless, but that they are limited. And so, again, I have been very fortunate to have a number of doors open for me. I've been very fortunate to have many opportunities afforded to me, but that is not the case for all. And so I think that, again, living here on the east side of Buffalo as an African-American male more specifically, it's very challenging because, again, you feel as if you don't have the same level of opportunity as other individuals. And so I pray that even as I return here to the city, and I'm not the only one, but there are a number of other individuals who have received formal training, who have been educated, and who have come right back home here to the city. I think that, we have a responsibility to help to lift up that misnomer that you can certainly excel beyond where you are now, that the possibilities that you have are indeed limitless, and that, again, where you are now is not where you will often, where you always will have to remain.
And most certainly it's quite the scene over at the Jefferson Avenue tops. The memorials that have been laid there in honor of the victims, of course, very touching, and the amount of them is really kind of overwhelming to a certain extent. There's no silver bullet, I'm sure, one specific thing that would help and make a big difference. But if there was one thing, if there was a place to start for Jefferson Avenue, for the east side of Buffalo, what would it be?
Again, I think that I, number one, applaud you for for also highlighting the fact that, again, there are multiple issues, multiple layers to this rebuilding process. But I think that a great starting point at this particular time, Jay, would be to continue to funnel those resources and to help build up what is right here in our backyard at Jefferson Avenue. I think that we not only just talk about having the emergence of various grocery stores where individuals can take part in, but I think we start to talk about creating more community gardens. I think we start to talk about building up the corridor. I think we have to start talking about infrastructure and how we, again, not only ensure that individuals have access to food and access to banking systems and have access to pharmacies and things of that nature, but also have access to jobs. Because if we're able to employ, we're able to build up infrastructure, you have to have individuals employed to maintain those systems. And so by doing that, I really believe that it's a start to letting individuals know that we not only care about the food need that you have, but we also care about building you up holistically. It goes right back to that old age-old adage that if you feed a man, if you teach a man how to fish, you'll feed him for a lifetime. And I think that's where we are now. We have to create those systems whereby we're able to teach people how to fish.
Of course, the shootings at the tops happened on a Saturday. Sunday morning services at around the area must have been memorable and very sad. What about for your congregation?
Well, again, we are having conversations once again similar to conversations that took place after the horrendous mass shooting in Charleston, South Carolina. Right now, we again have been heightened as it relates to our level of security. We have been in conversation with BPD as well as members of our congregation to increase security presence. Both those individuals who are plainclothes as well as uniformed police officers and security. However, the fact still remains that people are very much so nervous. I would dare to even say afraid, even being a part of a faith community where we're taught biblically that we have not been given a spirit of fear in our humanity. People are nervous, particularly when we talk about congregations such as Calvary, which are predominantly comprised of individuals who are 60 plus. Places just don't feel safe any longer. And so we're trying to do our very best to ensure that individuals feel safe when they come in so that they can receive what is needed upon their arrival. But as you can imagine, just not only here at Calvary, but throughout the country, people are just nervous because, again, if something isn't done as it relates to policy, and if individuals are still able to get their hands on weapons such as the one that was used, then certainly, again, there's a level of concern. So there's a great level of concern there, but we're trying to do our very best, not only here in the city, but across the country, to ensure that members of the congregation, parishioners, if you will, feel safe upon their arrival.
And Reverend, we've heard stories from other folks aren't going out. We're not going to go out to the grocery store. We're going to stay in. We just, like you said, there's that fear element there. Good to hear that you say that you sense that there's a focus on security inside the city, but are you comfortable with what has been accomplished so far on an official level when it comes to securing the city of Buffalo to the best possibility?
Again, we know that there are limitations within our policing, and we know that there are a number of other issues that need to be addressed. I believe, again, that because I've had access with, again, individuals who are in position to ensure that we have a police presence, they have been very receptive. They not only have been receptive, but they have ensured that we will have a police presence on hand whenever we gather as a congregation, and that has held true to form. But again, I also believe that it requires more. And what I mean by that is it requires more conversation in terms of not only the policing presence, but how do we equip, going back to what we talked about earlier, how do we equip individuals here within the community to be a part of this solution? How do we ensure that they're adequately equipped to take the exam and to be a part of this civil service and others? And then again, making sure that, again, the conversation doesn't die down as, again, we begin to return to some sense of normalcy. And I use that term very loosely. But I think that we, again, have to continue to hold a sense of accountability all around.
Some sense of normalcy. It does have a certain interesting ring to it, doesn't it, at this time? How about for you, just as somebody, a native of Buffalo, and, of course, like you said, a faith leader here in Buffalo, how have things been for you in the last couple of weeks?
Well, I must tell you that it's been extremely heavy. It's been extremely heavy because, again, you want to address many of the immediate needs that have come about as a result of this tragedy and as a result of losing this grocery store here in the community. But also you have a great level of concern about creating long-term impact, being in it for the long haul. So, again, it's been very heavy, but at the same time, I'm hopeful, I'm engaged and energized, I should say, by the work that is ahead. I am confident that we will continue to forge relationships within the community. And I think while we're at this place where we're, just 3 weeks or so, or 2 weeks or so from this tragic incident, I think that now we're in a great position where we can continue to engage in those conversations and do our part to see to it that we don't just return to life as it was, but that we continue to work to become even greater as a community, to become even better as a nation.
Reverend Corey Gibson of Calvary Baptist Church here in Buffalo, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you, Jace.
Time is 10:20. Coming up on Buffalo, what's next? We've got Brigid, Jaipaul, Valenza. She'll be joined by psychologist Ursuline Bankhead. That's coming up on Buffalo, What's Next?
Stream the best from Buffalo Toronto Public Media's YouTube channel. Adirondacks, Canadian Rockies by rail, Chautauqua, an American narrative, and so much more to watch. The very best of WNED PBS, now available on YouTube.
Watch, listen, engage, play, and learn with Buffalo Toronto Public Media stations and our weekly newsletter, The List. Sign up to receive the email at WNED.org and find out the best shows to watch, the great music to listen to, the important news you can't miss, and the many ways you can engage with our public media family. Sign up now at WNED.org.
This is Buffalo What's Next, where we have conversations with the community about moving forward. To have your voice heard, press the Talk to Us button on the WBFO app, and we'll work to get your questions and comments on the air. Join us on Twitter at WBFO or email us at news@WBFO.org. Together, we'll have the conversations that are needed. This is WBFO, your NPR station.
Hello, you're listening to Buffalo What's Next, where we critically examine and have real conversations about what led to the Tops shooting massacre and how we fix the issue. Thank you for joining us. I'm host Brigid Jaipaul Valenza. Today we're joined by Dr. Ursuline Bankhead, a local psychologist. Ursi, it's been a difficult time. How are you?
I'm doing okay right now. I'm a Buffalo girl, so this is my hometown. I left for a decade or so, and I've been back 20 years. But I think, it's good to have community and family and friends support, and that's been a positive.
Now, you've been down in that neighborhood, working in the neighborhood, assisting. How are people?
It's a mix. So, I was able to go down on Friday and offer some support to some colleagues. And it was really, I would say emotionally for myself and others, a mixed bag, where you have collegiality, you have community support, and you see everyone coming together. But at the same time, there was this feeling of, unrelenting grief, as you're there. So I would assume that it's, the normal mixture of emotions that people go through when there's a tragedy, as well as concerns about, again, what happens later, once the news cameras move on, and once we're expected, to go back to normal, understanding that that there will not be a norm, as a result. But I did see people struggling. Saw a lot of hugs, a lot of memorials, and also anger, and we can't, ignore that there's legitimate anger, sadness mixed in with those pockets of support and love and joy.
Do you get a sense of survivor's guilt happening right now?
That I'm sure that's happening. And I don't know how it couldn't, right? Psychologically, people who were there, someone is saying, it's not, well, why wasn't it me? Or feeling guilty because they, went into another room or in another section. Did I talk to anyone who experienced that? No, but it's a natural human emotion to say, well, why me? Or why did I survive? Just as normal of a human reaction for someone to say, well, why was it my loved one? Or why did I get shot? So I think we need to really normalize that we're going to get, 1,000 different responses, sometimes on the same day in the same hour. And that's really, part of our being human, it's to fluctuate through this.
It's okay to not be okay.
I think that we need to say that, louder for the people in the back, Yes. It's okay to not be okay because something horrific, terrible happened. And this isn't something people are going to shrug off in a month or in 2 months or even next year. This was an incredibly violent, targeted act, on a specific community that was targeted for simply being born, essentially. Not even essentially, factually targeted for being born, who happened to be in that place. And so there's going to be naturally years of grief.
Obviously, this massacre was predicated on racism. One of the principles was that black people are replacing white people. What do you have to say to that?
What I have to say to that is we really need to look at the radicalization of white males, via the internet, via other groups, right? So this idea of replacement isn't new, right? This was a conversation going back to Nazi Germany, the Jews will replace us was the refrain. So what happened isn't new. What is new is that it happened in our particular backyard. I think that this is where we need to have various conversations with different communities and honest conversations really about the history of Buffalo as well, right? Around our own ideas, our own behaviors of segregation and so on that allow for these messages to get embedded, so we need to pay attention and definitely, go, no, this isn't about replacement. This is about hatred. This is about prejudice. This is about white supremacy. And be very explicit and really name what's going on.
Do you think that racism is a mental health issue?
Well, it depends on how we want to look at it. What we know is
to hate someone solely for the color of their skin or orientation or whatever, that's...
So is it a mental health issue in the sense of, is it something diagnosable? No. To hate, so to target people, to victimize them and so on, is not a mental health issue in that having a diagnosis of schizophrenia is not going to make someone racist or someone homophobic or transphobic. Having a diagnosis of, an anxiety disorder or PTSD, for example, is not going to make you, racist, transphobic, etc. And so when we use that excuse of, someone had to have been mentally ill to have done this, these are two very different concepts. So you can be mentally ill, never, ever, ever do a violent act. Most people with mental illness never, ever, ever would do something like this. Hatred is definitely taught. Not saying that there can't be a mental illness component in some cases that, pushes this even further. But, we would have to say that going back to the, 1920s and Reconstruction, that all of the South, had a mental illness, right? So when we look at things like the KKK and so on, so you're telling all those Souths, look at, people who protested Ruby Bridges. Were all of those people mentally ill because that was rooted in hate? No, of course it wasn't. And so when we go this extremism and a person has been fed, and it's been, again, further indoctrinated and so on, to the point where he says, okay, I believe this is my truth, and I'm going to take on these violent acts. Now, again, maybe he does have a mental illness component, but not necessarily. So these are two, again, like I said, very different concepts.
I want to move off of that, off of him for a moment, and come back to the neighborhood.
Mm-hmm.
There have been lots of slogans going around and hashtags on social media, Buffalo, Buffalo, Buffalo Strong. Given our background, given the history of Buffalo and the history of that neighborhood and why it is the way it is and how it got to that point, this point, what do you say to those slogans? How do you feel about those?
So I tie those slogans a little bit into allyship, right? This idea, which is if we're going to say Buffalo and Buffalo Strong and we're going to hashtag it and so on, then what are we doing in action, right? So you can't just say, oh, Buffalo, and then ignore the neighborhood in 3 weeks. Or my question is, we say Buffalo, but were you going through that neighborhood, supporting that neighborhood, or were you saying perhaps derogatory things or avoiding that neighborhood before, Buffalo and Buffalo Strong, right? So in this moment, it's easy to care because there's a tragedy, but did you care 6 months ago? Or did you care a year ago? And will you care in another 6 months or a year? So, my thoughts on this is it is wonderful to have community, and it is wonderful that organizations are coming in, and some organizations have been there forever. But did you pay attention before, and will you pay attention later? Because that's where, if we're saying love, right, using the word love, if we're going to use that word, that's where it would manifest, would be in staying involved or invested or caring.
So what does a good ally look like? I mean, there are some folks out there who they want to help. Mm-hmm. They're not entirely certain how to go about that. And tied in with that is a bit of white fragility. So without wanting to maybe dismiss an ally, or to give of ourselves in our own grief, in our own tragedy, in our moment, we kind of also have to think of our allies. So what does a good ally look like, first of all?
So I think one of the things we have to recognize is allyship. Let's define it, right? And really, allyship is coming along someone. It's not, alongside a population or a group. It's not taking over, right? It's not saying, here's what you have to do because here's what I think is good for the community. It's really going into the community and saying, okay, let's have a really honest discussion about what's going on, what needs to happen, what has happened, and the injury it has caused, right? So allyship means I'm paying attention to actions and where my actions may be influenced some of these experiences. So I've had friends who have said, well, what can I do? And I go, listen, join an organization, educate yourself better, and not just any organization, so you may go to, Surge or, something like that. You may, say, well, maybe I'm going to get involved in ACLU as lawsuits come along. It may be, well, here, how can I help hands-on and, within the community? And all of that's really important. But it's also the perspective you have. Is it I'm going down there to save these people, or is it I'm going down there because they've been injured and my job is to work to help repair the injury? Right. And so that hopefully this injury will not persist. And by the way, when I screw up, because all of us screw up as allies, right, is to hold ourselves accountable, sit back, listen and go, okay, what have I learned from it so that I don't do injury again? Right. So the apology, the action, being engaged and moving forward, within that engagement is really, really critical. So there's some ways you read a book and then you say, how do I take what I learned in action? And it's not just reading books. Who else do I talk to? What else can I learn? And again, how do I hold myself responsible for when I've done a microaggression, or when I can say, oh man, I'm just going to drive through that neighborhood and offer support. And all you did was drive through, and it's just voyeurism. Go, well, what was that about? So allyship is constantly questioning ourselves.
So there's a real sense of self-reflection that needs to happen for an ally, for someone to be a good ally.
Right. I mean, allyship is definitely self-reflective. Other than that, it's pretty performative. It is, look at me, look at me. So one would hope that it would be self-reflective. I keep hoping that as a community, that our city, our region, that we become self-reflective more so, and about how we got here, and then do action so that we can get rid of some of the things, that allowed someone to pinpoint and target a community.
I'm Brigid Jaipaul Valenza. You're listening to Buffalo What's Next on WBFO. We're talking today to Dr. Ursuline Bankhead, a local psychologist, about the Tops massacre. What do you say to microaggressions? So, it's certainly a word that has come up. How would you explain that to someone, to say, okay, this is an actual microaggression. This is what you have done, and this is why it's bad.
So one of the examples I have, microaggression is typically a thoughtless act, right? That's so embedded in our culture. So the example I always give is my husband is a 6'5" tall black man, and people get wary around him. Children don't, but adults will sometimes, go, oh, let me avoid this giant man, right? That in and of itself is a microaggression. They've assumed danger, and the aggression part is they've taken action, right? So things including, my title's doctor, I'm a black female, someone's going, oh, you can't be doctor. I want to meet the real Dr. Bankhead, and those things happen, fairly often. So, so sometimes for myself, I will correct people and say, okay, explain to me what made you say or do that. Help me further understand, because it's typically so beneath our awareness, right? When we assume that a couple, if someone says, oh, my spouse, and we assume, opposite, gender, right? But as far as, race, part of a microaggression is someone driving down Jefferson Avenue and automatically locking their doors and assuming danger. Someone who grew up over in those neighborhoods and in the Fruit Belt, I felt very safe. There's issues everywhere, but I grew up very safe. And I don't lock my door any more there than I do in Clarence, So, so microaggressions, it's paying attention. And when somebody calls us in or calls us out on those behaviors, again, going back to that reflection and saying, well, why did I respond that way?
Right. Again, that really, truly about that self-reflection. So I want to talk a little bit right now about the trauma of this, the trauma of what has happened. Trauma stays with the body.
Right.
Trauma stays with a community. Trauma stays with an individual. How do we deal with that somatic response to the trauma that is being witnessed?
I think that this is where, depending on the individual, right? So where faith communities, this is where therapy, psychotherapy, and all of that fits in together, which is paying attention. So let's be honest, from trauma, we have everything from insomnia, stomach issues, headaches, higher blood pressure, tension in the shoulders, neck, head, muscle weakness. Sometimes your joints tighten up. So you have the potential for full body pain or discomfort and so on, as well as psychological. So when we're talking about somatics, the basic, so body issues, the basics are paying attention, learning how to do progressive muscle relaxation. In other words, where to tense the body and start to loosen it. Paying attention to where you no longer feel good, but you felt okay a month ago. Learning how to do things like deep breathing, doing apps, but also getting help and talking about the trauma. And I think for the larger community, please don't tell people, well, it's been X amount of time, you all should be over it. This is going to be generations of people learning how to manage trauma. Trauma does not go away. So it's learning how to cope, how to manage, how to deal, and so on.
What do you think is next for the community?
I think what is next, what I hope is next, is that we go back to having honest discussions about how we got here. We talk to the community honestly about what can help. I hope that our politicians weren't just here for photo ops, and so on. And I think that the community really needs to push, our, community leaders, whatever that means, as well as legislators and so on, to say, okay, we've been invisible for a long time and it took a shooting for you to pay attention to us. So I'm hoping that that dialogue and action are what comes next.
Thank you, Dr. Ursuline Bankhead, for joining us for this absolutely necessary and critical discussion. I'm host Brigid Jaipaul Valenza. Up next is WBFO News Director David Debo with local lawyer Miles Gresham. Stay with us.
Stream the best from Buffalo Toronto Public Media's YouTube channel. If Our Water Could Talk, Erie County Fair, 2 Frederick Law Olmsted documentaries, and so much more to watch. The very best of WNED PBS, now available on YouTube.
It's one thing to love public media, but it's a special thing to support it. Consider this. If you've got a car you don't need anymore, or you've got one that's simply too expensive to repair, arrange to donate it to Buffalo Toronto Public Media. It's easy for you. Pickup is free, and it could be worth hundreds of dollars in support. Here's how to get started. Go to WNED.org/vehicles. You're listening to Buffalo What's Next. There are several ways for you to join the conversation. Send us a message now on Twitter @WBFO. Email us at news@WBFO.org, or just press the Talk to Us button on the WBFO app and leave a comment we can use on the air. We're here for you. This is Buffalo What's Next.
This is Dave Debo. Thank you for joining us this morning. My guest this next 20 minutes or so is Miles Gresham from the Partnership for the Public Good. He is a policy fellow there. You may have heard his name in the news because he has often been involved in the discussion about police reform. We're certainly going to touch on that. And in a general sense, there are issues about, Partnership for Public Good, public policy is an issue that we can get into as well. So thanks for joining us for the discussion. Miles, glad you're here.
Hey, Dave, thanks for having me.
A lot of the discussion, I think, immediately after the shooting was, the shooter's not from here. I'm assuming you would take a different point of view that does not matter, that systemic racism is here, that racism is here, and the fact that he came from Binghamton is a so what?
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, first of all, Binghamton is part of our sort of outer orbit, if you will. It's not that far away. But, if you'll recall, the day after the shooting, there was racist graffiti sprayed on a family's fence in Niagara Falls. They regularly have white supremacists running for office in the North towns. So no, I don't think it matters. Systemic racism, like we were talking about, didn't pick up a gun and kill people. But that philosophy, that deep-seated racism and hatred, is all around this area.
Let me go a little bit further. There are white supremacist candidates in the North Towns. What do you mean when you say that?
Well, if you look at some of the folks who sometimes run in Lewiston and those areas, there are folks who will say that they want to keep Lewiston white, that they want to reflect white supremacist values. So, I mean, this is not, you go into certain parts of even our suburbs around Buffalo, you'll see Confederate flags flying. So again, racism and racist is not something that's exclusive to Binghamton. It's all around Buffalo. It's all around Western New York. And it's all around this country.
Do you think because it's prevalent that it has become unnoticed and tolerated?
By some people, yeah. I mean, I think, as a black person, you can't help but notice it, and it's intolerable. For people
Yeah, by no means was I saying we should accept it.
Sure.
But I think the populace at large, white and black, I guess, probably doesn't notice it as much, maybe, is what I'm thinking.
I don't know. I think that we do kind of. I think as a black person, and I think some white people do. I think they notice it, but I think if you speak up on every instance of racism in this society, you're known as someone who's too woke, or someone who's too focused on race, if you will. And so I think that there is a degree of. I don't know if tolerance is the right word, but there's a degree of acceptance, whether you're dealing with it in the workplace, whether you're dealing with it out on the street, as long as someone doesn't come up to you and call you the N-word, it's unfortunately sort of, you kind of go about your day until it does something that you can't ignore, like what happened on May 14th.
I don't want to make you any more of a personal example than you're willing to make yourself. So if this is a bad question, just let me know and we'll move on. How do you deal with it? Anything short of the N-word. If you just see some sort of racism that's directed at you, do you speak up? Do you confront it?
I generally do, yes. But then again, I'm an attorney. I have the ability to, speak up and not lose my job. You know what I mean? Every black person doesn't have that privilege in Western New York. So yeah, I personally do. And also, the reason that I work in public policy is because, I believe in fighting it where it affects us and my people the most, and that's in our public policies, in the way that we deal with each other and in government. So.
Miles Gresham is with us. He's with the Partnership for Public Good. This might be as good a point as any then to talk about the partnership. What exactly is it? What does it do?
So the Partnership for the Public Good is a local think tank. We work with over 300 community partners. We do research that sort of helps inform their work. So public policy research on things like criminal justice reform, like segregation, like economic and political policy issues. So that's in a nutshell what we do.
And back in 2018, the partnership came out with a report called A City Divided, A Brief History of Segregation in Buffalo. Document some of that, looking at the fact that we are such a segregated city. Give me the highlights.
Yeah, so that report was done by my colleague, Anna Blotto. The highlights, really, it talks about the history of segregation in Buffalo and how it translates into us being a segregated city still today. So it starts with, the history of racial covenants, excluding people from selling their homes to black people. Once those were struck down as illegal in 1917, I believe it was, there were still private racial covenants. So first there were like racial zoning laws, right, that the government actually put into place. Those were struck down in 1917. Then you have racial covenants in private contracts and deeds preventing people from selling their homes to black people. You have FHA policies where loans would not be extended to people who lived in certain neighborhoods or people of a certain race.
Basically redlining.
Yes, redlining, right.
Sure.
And that's redlining on the federal level. You also had redlining on the private level with respect to banks who would not give loans out to black and brown people. And even today, even though, we think that redlining has gone away, I, as a black person with my credit score and income, am less likely to get a loan than a white person with the same credit score and income today. So.
And then you throw in some housing discrimination, and then you throw in, what the heck, let's put a throughway, an expressway. We'll call it the Kensington.
It's for a little
through the middle.
Razzle.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yes.
Destroy some communities.
Yep.
Clearly, the East Side became the East Side, you would argue, because of design. Because of these policies.
Yes, because of those policies, because of, I mean, even, I was a kid in the 80s. I was born in 86. But, we think of, Jimmy Griffin, deciding on which streets to plow first. He said, we have to plow the south side and basically the areas where white people live first because those people have to go to work. You know what I mean? So there's this sort of reinforced racism throughout time that these designs help to ferment and that people, help to reinforce. And so that's why you get a segregated city where 85% of black people live east of Main Street in the city of Buffalo.
Some of other numbers from the report. White people are 76% of the Erie County population, but only 45% of the city of Buffalo. Black people are 13% of the Erie County population, but 37% of the city of Buffalo. And of all the people who identify as black within the city of Buffalo, the number you just mentioned, 85% live east of Main Street.
Right.
If we have this kind of segregation and someone like the shooter in Binghamton knows about it and comes here to perpetrate violence, talk about what happens after that. Does the segregated structure engender in any way the violence or at least systemic racism?
I think it made us sort of sitting ducks in a particular way because the shooter just had to, research, where is the black grocery store, right? There shouldn't be a black grocery store. There should be grocery stores where everyone has equal access to. But we know that, the east side of Buffalo is what's known as a food desert, right? Which means it's very difficult, particularly if you don't have a car, which many people do not, to have access to a grocery store where you have fresh food and vegetables and that sort of thing. And so, all he had to do was search for the black grocery store, which is the Tops on Jefferson, which is the only full-service grocery store in that area, and then go and enact the violence that racism engenders. Just carry that out in a particularly heinous way.
So his hatred wasn't a product of the segregation, but the ease of his mission, I guess, you're saying. Yeah,
I mean, I think that the segregation certainly reinforces hatred, right? It helps to otherize a community, right? I know I've been told growing up in Buffalo, by white people on Hurdle, go back to the east side, this idea that black people live over there and that white people live over here. It's the concept of the other. It's the concept of, we don't go to the east side of Main Street. It's the concept of, I've had colleagues talk about how frightened they were of having to drive home late and they, had to take Jefferson from the sort of Larkinville complex where I used to work, right? So this otherizing concept is reinforced by that segregation. So no, redlining and segregation did not, physically pick up a gun and shoot people, but certainly that segregation contributed to that idea of otherizing that shooter internalized.
And in all of the discussions about this event, I think it's a given that people say, whether they mean it or not, you hear the phrase "hate has no home here," that hate can perhaps be addressed, but the how, to my mind, is perhaps a little harder. Segregation, on the other hand, there are practical remedies for, no?
Yeah, there are practical remedies for segregation. I would push back on that idea.
And that's not to say hate isn't something we should address. I'll get to that in a second. But,
right.
But what can we do about segregation?
We can dismantle the policies that caused it in the first place, right? So we can be unequivocal about the remnants of redlining that still exist in private banks today. We can make sure that there are more opportunities for affordable housing, not just in the city of Buffalo, but also in the county where affordable housing numbers are quite abysmal. We can support and fund the Black-led organizations on the ground that are responding to this crisis right now. I mean, there's an African Heritage Food Co-op that's been in existence for years that owns farmland, that works to deliver fresh produce to Black and brown people in this city. Those people have been working overtime since this shooting happened. fund their grocery store, fund their brick and mortar, so that there's more than one option for Black people on the east side of Buffalo to go and get their fruits and veg. There are all different kinds of ways to do, these policies that created segregation were created by people, and they can be dismantled by people. And I think that's how you hit at the root of the problem.
Are you saying people, or are you essentially saying government? Should budgets change when you say funding? Is that a role for city or state or federal government? Or are you talking about entrepreneurship from the outside? From where does funding come?
Well, when I say people, I do mean government, because this is America, right? We have the government of the people, right? It comes from all different levels. Private businesses are generally incentivized by government in this country, right? So we can incentivize the African Heritage Food Co-op just like we give tax breaks to a Tops or a Wegmans to open up in Buffalo or anywhere else, right? So there's that part of it. There are folks who want to, donate in the aftermath of a crisis, right? Donate to the people. The biggest crisis is that right now, it's a real food desert in 14208 because the one supermarket that was there is now shut down, and people didn't have that many options before. So fund the people giving them options. If you want to give money in the wake of this crisis, give it to people who are delivering food and getting food to people, and doing so in a sustainable way. So it's not just, food deliveries in an emergency, but an actual, brick and mortar, another option that comes out of this, So that's a way to do it. So governments can fund it, private individuals can fund it, budgets can fund it, right? Budgets, as we talked about, are moral documents, right? So in our city, in our county, in our state, instead of funding, more policing, which has a limited, return on investment, fund economic opportunities for people who have historically been discriminated against.
And I knew you'd get there because it is a policy area for you particularly. You were a member of the Erie County Corrections Specialist Advisory Board, the Erie County Police Reform and Reinvention Task Force. Criminal justice reform has a role in this discussion. Tell me what it is.
Well, I think that policing has played a role in enforcing segregation, in enforcing and reinforcing the concept of racism in Buffalo and throughout this country, right? So one of the things that we can do to push back against racism is to think about policing differently, right? That means holding the police that do commit misconduct and that brutalize and kill Black people unjustly, holding those people accountable and not allowing them to keep their jobs. It also means training existing police, the ones who are good, to engage with the community on a different level, so that they're not, so that the community is seen as neighbors, so that the police see them as members of their own community instead of enemy combatants. Again, the idea of other, the idea of over there, that's the thing that we have to break down when we talk about policing. Hold the police accountable and also integrate them into our community so that, there's not this sense of otherness. There's this sense of police are members of our community protecting the rest of us.
And before we close here, I did want to jump back to just the idea of eliminating hate. I know that gets theoretical very quickly. How do we do it, though? What can be done?
So, Dave, I'm from a philosophical perspective, first and foremost, I'm a Christian. One of the things that we believe is that we don't, that we fight against principalities in high places, right? So this idea is that we don't fight against the people, we fight against the idea. And so, striking back against this terror act doesn't mean striking back against this person or the community they come from. It means striking back at the idea, and that means, again, dismantling the systems that have allowed hate to thrive, dismantling segregation, dismantling policing in a way that brutalizes people. That's how I think we strike back at hate. You can't do it by training people not to hate people anymore. You do it by giving historically discriminated against people the same opportunities and the same access as everyone else has.
All right. Miles, thanks so much for the discussion. Great time.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
Miles Gresham is with the Partnership for Public Good. Thanks to all of today's guests. Earlier, obviously, we had the Reverend Corey Gibson and Ursuline Bankhead. And eventually down the road, we'd love to have you a guest. We want to hear from you. You can use the Talk to Us feature on the WBFO app and leave us a message, or send your comments and questions via Twitter @WBFO or email news@WBFO.org. Again, thank you for listening. This is a program that really unapologetically confronts the reasons why that May 14th mass shooting occurred and what role we can all take in solving the problems that spring from that. We'll be back for you tomorrow. That is our promise to you here at WBFO and WBFO HD1 Buffalo, WOLN Olean, and WUBJ Jamestown, your NPR station.